What's happening? What's happening? What's happening, blues people? Welcome to another. I don't use the term fabulous, but I'm going to say fabulous episode, fabulous day, a fabulous vibe because we just went through God knows how many storms, and we are definitely thinking about praying for and sending good energy to the families that lost homes, people, and everything that happens in these extreme situations. But welcome to Jack Dappa Blues Radio, blues people, where we not only explore, but we raise awareness and give the proper context of the living traditions, cultural memory, and sonic legacies of blues people. Some say Black Americans, some say Afro Indigenous. I say blues people because it's one and the same in my book. And they're our life ways, our folklore, our expressions. And y'all know who I am, so don't worry about me. Let's talk about my featured guest, Kandia Crazy Horse, who is the lead singer of Cactus Rose New York. She is a trailblazer in every sense of the word. She's an Afro Indigenous artist, a rock journalist, a scholar, a country singer. We're going to get into that too, because I listened to what I believe to be her first album and her most current album with Cactus Rose New York. We want to get into that. She challenges the erasure of Black Indigenous voices in American music history. Once seen as an anomaly in rock journalism, she flipped the script, editing the landmark collection Rip It Up, The Black Experience in Rock and Roll, teaching cultural revolt at Princeton. Come on now. And fronting her own band rooted in country tradition and ancestral spirit. In this conversation, we'll explore Candia's journey, and experience through broader lands between genres, identities, and institutions. We'll talk sonic and we'll talk landscape. We'll talk soundscape. And I kind of paused there because sometimes sonic and soundscape can be interchangeable. Sometimes they're not. Okay. Black and Indigenous memory and what it means to create music that not only heals but disrupts. Ooh, intersection, double conundrum. So, I mean, let's just get to it. I've talked way too much. How are you, good sister?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing fairly well. I'm actually quite excited, particularly how you and I met via Instagram on a post,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And the post was I travel like yourself and many of my viewers who are either like us, either musicians or scholars and the like. And I was just noticing in my travels there are a lot of townships, towns, and parishes and the like, and counties and areas that have indigenous names, but I don't see the people. And it was good, So and then when I posted that, and then I posted the context and the image, you jumped on and you gave some great context, and that started our dialogue. So please let me welcome you to the show. I have to hook up my applause track. Forgive me for not being prepared. So you said something interesting to me though. Um, when we spoke on the phone, and I kind of want to start there if it's okay with you. The idea that you are more immersed in your indigenous culture and community than what is considered Black American. Did I misunderstand that or misinterpret that?
No, that's correct. At this point in my life, I am more immersed in the indigenous community of Lenape Hawking, which is New York City area. And I'm on the powwow circuit this season, and I attend events of organizations like the Urban Indigenous Collective that just went to their East Coast Summit for missing and murdered Indigenous women
Mm-hmm.
last Friday. And with my music, largely has a local Indigenous following. So that's pretty much the case now. I mean, I grew up in a predominantly Latino, or I should say probably Chicano neighborhood. And my parents were Pan Africanists, so we knew people that were in the movement and in struggle, but we also knew allies from other races and were surrounded by them. Our first language was basically Spanish, and we later learned French. Between the ages of 8 and 19, I lived off and on in Africa and had a lot more orientation towards the motherland than I did to America.
Mm-hmm.
But it once I moved here to Lenape after I was 19 years old, I became connected to the local indigenous population, starting with going to the American Indian Community House back when it was down on Broadway in the Village, and started getting to know other indigenous people.
So now that's a very interesting journey, right? To say the least. Um,
People think so.
I get so well. Well, what I would like to ask is it cultural? Is it bloodline? Because that's a big, considering the discourse that is happening today currently, this idea that, well, there is a group of black folk that is not from Africa, but actually are indigenous to this land, and then there's a group that are from Africa by many ways of the diaspora, right? Now you've been, I mean, being part of the Pan African movement already suggests the African centered. So what was the connection? I guess is my question, because there's so many people who like to say we, those of us that are darker hued, are not actually indigenous to the Americas. So if you don't mind, if you what was the connection, or how did you come about saying, wait a minute, this is where I belong?
One side of my family is indigenous. I always knew about it, not too much when I was a really little kid, but my grandmother, who was indigenous, would refer to it as well as her very distant Scottish ancestry. And I always felt the pull in blood memory to my side. Our nation is Pamunkey. This is from Atan Akamic, and our homelands are in Virginia, D.C., and the eastern shore of Maryland. And once I became older and more acquainted with my great aunts, my grandmother's sisters, I got to know more about our heritage. I do not subscribe to that school of Black people here who want to say that Blacks were the original natives and that Native people are colonizers. I don't believe in that.
So what? So okay. So wow. That so. What would you like to say that you believe in that space? Is it so?
How do you
Is it? I guess my question um, were there? Uh, I don't like to use the term mixing, but were there Africans and indigenous people that were coming together, and then the I guess offsprings become dark brown indigenous and brown indigenous and the like, or are you talking in regards to this quite aggressive discourse of everyone is attacking?
Yes, there's definitely been a long history of intermarriage and cultural sharing between Blacks that are African descended and indigenous people of Turtle Island. And I'm the result of that mixing. There are Black passing indigenous people as well as there are white passing indigenous people. Of course, the white passing ones are more celebrated and get
Okay.
more opportunities and tend to be embraced more readily by indigenous communities rather than the Black passing ones that are questioned and scrutinized about their lineage, needing to prove their bona fides about being indigenous. Um,
That you answered my question. You answered my question. So, is it fair to say? And then I want to. I'm going to ask more about this, but I want to move to a couple of some music for a minute. But before we move to music, is it fair to say, based on your statement, there are uh, darker hued indigenous that could be taken for African or Black American that are actually not, but because of their, I guess, physical makeup, they're not readily believed, and they're not necessarily products of intermarrying. That's that's just, I guess, we're men, right? And then there's those that are not.
yes.
Okay. So ultimately, like every other, it is in the way I said. The reason why I laugh, because when you think of Israelites in the Bible, you think of all these different groups. There's a myriad of color schemes, and because of the, I guess, social construct, these things become more important than they were when people were just tribal. Am I making sense?
No, I don't think I follow you.
Well, what I'm saying is when you look at all, when you look at the there's what you and I are discussing, I've seen in different sects. The idea of what we can call colorism, racism. I'm not even talking about who was first, who's who, just the fact that there's a rainbow of people in all tribes. But because of the system that we're all in, culture kind of takes a back seat to colorism, and those people trying to I guess having to prove that they're what they are and what they're not because of color rather than because of tribal and cultural connection. Does that make sense?
Well, my nation is one that disenfranchised the mixed homunci at a certain time over a century ago. And
Could you
there are
explain that?
it's very simple. They dispossessed the mixed homunci of their entitlements and participation in the tribal culture. And to this day, we very belatedly got federal recognition. There are, I see in the news instances of fellow Black homunculus who have tried to get in contact with getting their place settled on the reservation and getting pushed back from the tribe. And they're fighting with them about getting their entitled role in the tribe. So it's something that's ongoing.
So black folk is catching hell everywhere, is what you're telling me.
Yeah, well, that's something we know, don't we?
Yes, that's not funny, but yes, yes. Your response was so earnest. It tickled me, but yes, it is something we know. What I have to ask you this before I get to the music, because what one of the things that I look to understand and try to raise awareness of is the idea that if someone is not fair skinned, then they're not obviously, this is how it's framed. If they're not fairer skinned or this what can be considered a Western depiction of indigenous of the Americas, then they're either half African or something else. Where there's quite a few people that said there's no traces of nowhere but the Americas in their family bloodline, right? So what I'm asking you is, no, I guess what I'm asking you is could it is there situations where the brown and darker brown indigenous are not the product of intermarriages, but are actually just the product of America? For based on your understanding.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, okay. Now, with that being said, I have to ask you about your first album first. And the
Stampede? Yes.
and the reason why I want to ask you about that album first is because I was beyond impressed when I heard slide guitar. I heard what is considered the rooted tradition of country music in this entire album. So I need to understand what inspires you at that time. And we know, you've been a music critic for a long time. So were you always into country? Were you how did we get to that album?
I've always loved country music. I grew up in the household with my father, who's from the African descended half of my family that's based in Southwest Georgia. He grew up listening to country. My grandmother and her sisters would cook and sing Hank Williams songs. And I would watch Hee Haw and country specials on TV with my father and always shared a love for that music.
Hmm.
But country, I've always loved country and I didn't have any ambiguities about that. Um, as far as my recording such an album, it had to do with the loss of my mother. My mother was a jazz fanatic and into African music and Motown, and she imparted all this to me. So when she went to join the Ancestors, I thought about ways that I could honor her. I decided I didn't want to write a biography. I didn't have the means to make a film, but I decided I wanted to make an album in tribute to her. Ultimately, I wasn't allowed to make that so evident, but um, the title Stampede comes from this lost album of the band Buffalo Springfield, which is my favorite band of all time. And it was called Stampede and it never got put out. So I was thinking of them as a source when I began writing the album. And I just always knew the songs were going to have twang. I don't know how they all came together that way, but they did. I was influenced by uh, most stuff out of the Laurel Canyon scene in California, in what our Tongva relatives call Tavangar. Um, that music was made by a lot of Southerners who meshed hippie music with country and rock, and also some soul. So I have songs on the album like Quartz Hill that are
Mm-hmm.
in Americana that are very much inspired by that. I'm also inspired by Appalachian folk and indigenous rhythms and elements from the southeast of the US. So that's how it all came together. And I've just gone on in that same vein since then with my second album, Canyons, which was unreleased, and then our most recent EP, the first one with Cactus Rose NYC, which is titled Live from Lenape Hawking Field Recordings.
Yeah, I want to get to that too, because you have a extensive background in writing, scholarship, and then the idea of folklore and ethnomusicology and field recording is that's my what I guess you could say my lane. So I was really uh intrigued at this field recording and what what was the deciding factor? What made you say let's do it this way? How did Cactus Rose New York come about, and then what were the inspirations behind the decisions of approaching it the way you have?
At first, I was a solo artist who was working with Shakira's musical director and members of her band. That's how I recorded the albums in the first two, down in Florida at Cherokee Studios. And we worked together on formulating the songs. But after that, I had an initial band called Spirit of 76 that never recorded, but just played around in the Brooklyn country scene for a while until that fizzled out. That's when I was referred to Jeff McLaughlin, my second guitarist, who's not Indigenous. And we were a duo for a long time as Cactus Rose NYC. Uh, but at the beginning of last year, last January, my other guitarist, Lonnie Harrington, who was a Black Seminole, he's Seminole, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Cherokee descent. And he joined, and we became a trio. And that's when things started to kind of become more opportunities for us.
Um, what there's something that I really appreciate in this conversation that you're doing. You um make sure that you allow the audience to know who, what, and where the folk you discuss, as well as yourself, comes from, right? Like when we're growing up, depending on where you're, oh, that's I don't know, that's Jimmy. He's from the Richards family. Something that we used to do a lot. Um, is it significant for you to make these distinctions and contextualize, or is that just to make giving information? Is it not necessarily significant, just part of the story?
Well, if I understand what you're saying, is my songs, the subjects are primarily indigenous from all facets of Indian country.
Okay.
And the aim of my performances is to amplify the voices of indigenous people, urban natives in New York City, and specifically also the so-called Afro Indigenous people that are mostly invisible because of erasure and the loss of family ties and loss of ties to their homelands.
Okay. So yeah, well, you do understand, and that is what I was asking, because again, you were clearly saying, well, this person is not this, but there's this. This person is this. So that context for me, it means that means it's something of importance. So I just was trying to bring, why was it important, and you answered. Okay, so now opportunities arise. What any particular reason you decided to do a field recording of this particular project?
I didn't really prepare a whole idea of doing one. It's more just kind of happenstance. There was a Guyanese folk musician named Gavin Mendonca who came up from there to New York to study sound engineering. And somehow we got connected, and he said he was offering this opportunity of recording live in a public space. So I settled on Central Park, and as you can see in the videos on our YouTube channel, we went there and performed a certain number of songs. And I decided, after I heard the stems and went through it all, that it could be a viable live recording. So out of that, I produced the EP Live from Lenape Hawking Field Recordings.
Understood. I dig it. So now you're intentional about raising the voice of, right? And making aware and making seen. Um what as you described that there are so-called Afro Indigenous or Black Indigenous that are uh being challenged and fighting for, I guess, birthright. Um what are some of the challenges that you've either witnessed, experienced? What and then I guess walk us through some of the songs that address this.
You mean challenges I've faced being Afro Indigenous?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I mean, the main thing is pushback from both sides. I've had peers, friends of my father that were in the movement who lampooned people that claimed to be Black and Native. They thought that they were ridiculous and conveyed that to me. On the other end, I've had so called full bloods from Native organizations not really include me in their circles because of being also Black. And that's something that everybody who has this heritage has to deal with. Um, there's, of course, as we know, certain nations that have expelled their African descended members because of not being on the Dawes rolls or other things like that. Um, that's something that's ongoing, a fight to stay connected to one's own tribal community.
So now there are still people, right, that make the claims that you make on both sides, right? Meaning there are still Pan-Africanists. They use the term pretendian, right? Then there's still indigenous that they use other terms, right? I've heard wobble. I heard all types of things coming from all types of people. Um, I think what I'm interested in this sense is the people that get that treatment from both sides, but they claim no African connection. So what? And you made it very clear you don't subscribe to that. What I'm asking you is, have you interacted with that sect, or did you get any pushback from that side?
Which side?
That the Black indigenous, Afro indigenous, if you will, that make no claim to having anything to do with Africa, and so they're kind of in a space that you are, but they're not claiming Africa in no sense. They're telling and showing evidence of just Turtle Island.
No, I haven't necessarily encountered any.
I think, and one of the reasons why I asked this is because I'm not sure if it is because of digital media, social media, and this global connection that we all have, that we're seeing more things than we may have before. So it seems like, as some people say, all the truth is coming out, if you will. But I am seeing an influx of this discourse of who's indigenous, who's not, all the derogatory terms. And I'm wondering, is that doing a disservice, considering in all these spaces, the same group of people are pretty much being disenfranchised? So should Pan Africanists, Afro Indigenous, and the like be at odds, or because we're still getting the same treatment in all these spaces?
Well, we shouldn't be at odds. We're of the same people, same cultures. We should be standing in unison against the real issues, which is settler colonialism and its many headed problems that it causes. Um, I don't know what the true answer is, but there I don't I don't agree with the Pan Africanists trying to claim to be the true indigenous people of the Americas. I just I just don't subscribe to that.
Um, you just came off tour,
Yes.
and now, so your fan base is mostly indigenous. It, I don't. I want to say Valerie June's fan base is a little broader. So, but I'm not sure how the tour was set up. So I'm trying to be careful with how I frame the question. But the songs, and I listen to the songs, and you, particularly the Cactus Rose. I really want to play some of these songs, but I'm not going to. You discuss specific cultural things in these songs. How is it received by non-indigenous audiences? Do they even know what you're referring to? First of all,
Well, the tour came about because I've been friends with Valerie June since she first was coming up from Memphis to the city and considering moving to New York. It was Greg Tate, my family friend, the late, great Greg Tate, who advised her to make the move. And I used to see her play at Terra Blues to a very small amount of people up till now, where she's at Red Rocks and all these major venues across Turtle Island. And it's been very great to see her rise. Um, Out of our friendship, I got offered by her team to open some dates of her Owls, Omens, and Oracles tour, which is the tour she's on through 2025. And we went starting at Town Hall in Manhattan, which was a major milestone in Cactus Rose NYC's career, is to get to play such a legendary hall where Judy Collins and Pete Seeger and all these um, famous folk artists have played. Uh, that first night went over very well. I could feel a lot of energy and good vibes from the audience. I have a song called Bury My Heart at Rock Creek Park, which has a clapping section, and the audience clapped along with me. So that's when I knew we were on the same wavelength. Now, it was a very different audience than we're accustomed to. There were a lot more of the, say, NPR listeners in the audiences that we encountered. So I did, in between songs, make reference to the indigenous peoples and the titles that were being discussed in the songs. So they would have an idea of where we were coming from and know that we are specifically amplifying the voices of Indigenous people.
Now, talk to us about your connection to folk music, possibly folk art, right? Uh, and custom, as you one listen to music and what you like, but two, as a performer, I've seen and heard all these things, at least in my mind, come together in your performance.
Well, when my twin sister and I were small, we went to camp in Virginia, and I learned folk songs there and square dancing and all sorts of things like that. I also grew up going to the Smithsonian's Folk Life Festival with my mother for years, and there is where I got to see both our Plains relatives on the drum, but um, people from Appalachia that were playing the way they do on porches in the Southeast, playing banjo, playing jugs, playing guitar, playing mandolin and fiddle. I got exposed to it through that. And in class at school, we also learned different folk songs. It was the culture of the time. So um, it started there, and when I started to write songs, it came back to me and infused some of the songs that I've written, and that's it.
No, no, I mean that's groovy. I want to get to rip it up the Black experience in rock and roll and cultural revolt, teaching cultural revolt at Princeton. I mean, you have a really um, lengthy, and I guess I would call it advocacy, right, in your work. It seems that everything has a purpose and a particular purpose. Could you talk to us about those two projects, and then how your purpose, how you found your purpose, if that makes sense?
Rip It Up, the Black Experience in Rock and Roll was a project that came out of a deal that James Spooner, the director of Afropunk, had at St. Martin's. And somehow through the process, I got asked to take over and edit the project. So I contributed to it, but I also rounded up a great number of people to contribute essays, including Paul Gilroy and Greg Tate did the introduction, and we had people like Amy Linden, who's one of the rock critics that I looked up to when I was starting. And ultimately, we had an event for the release of the book at CBGB's, which was still open then, had some of the local New York Black rock bands perform to impart about the music that was coming up behind the artists that were described in the book. Um, it I never totally officially joined the Black Rock Coalition, but I was a fellow traveler since I was 19. I used to go to the Frank Silvera workshop in Harlem where they used to have meetings, and started to get to know people by and by, and would go out to support their bands and cover them once I was a critic. Um, since I was born to be a revolutionary by my parents' decree, it was not difficult to think about advocating for Black rock artists. There was a very clear demarcation between them and white rockers and what sort of opportunities were afforded to them. So it was clear that something needed to be done to fight back against that reality of the music industry mishandling Black artists who decided to do rock or alternative music. Um, that thing about the alternative music carried over to Black artists that were doing country and country adjacent music. I started writing about them quite early on, while I was covering Southern rock bands, and I first met and covered the Carolina Chocolate Drops right after they came down from the Black Banjo Gathering at Boone,
Right.
and um, did a lot of work around that. I'm friends with the Ebony Hillbillies who are here, based in Queens,
Yes.
and I've gone to their performances and also when they perform at this event in Harlem called the Harlem Hoedown, and we have them providing the music and a troupe of square dancers who are based in Chelsea come uptown and have this with a mechanical bull and all sorts of things going along with it. That has been a gratifying event to have centered in Harlem, even though we get a lot of pushback from the locals. Um,
Really?
yeah, they say this is Harlem, this music doesn't belong here. People don't forget that almost all the people who are based in Harlem, the majority of them migrated from the South and have
Correct.
roots down there, still have kin down there. And there's something bizarre about Black culture where they want to self deny and self erase aspects of our culture instead of preserving them. And
Ooh.
that goes on and on. And so that's why the current like Black banjo movement and the work that Rissy Palmer's doing with Color Me Country Radio and all of these things are important to get the fact that we have just as much of a stake in Americana and folk and country music restored to us instead of being divorced from our Black experience.
Yeah, you said a mouthful. Early on, as I called myself reintroducing traditional blues to I guess our age group, what have you, I was asked why am I dealing in slave music, and I was like, wow. I remember a group of a group of friends of mine uh were going to, and they perform Piedmont style, and they were introduced as a group doing music from roots. And these are Black people saying this, and I was just really initially disappointed, but I guess I kind of realized what we are all up for, not necessarily against, but up for, because I have to believe everyone is not self-sabotaging and self-denying intentionally, because some people don't want to be connected to certain memories. Even Big Bill Bronzy said in the 30s they don't want to be remembered of the horse and buggy days. I get that, but there's just other people, I think they just, to your point, either don't know or do not make the connection that your people was from down there and this is what was going on. I don't know. But I'm happy you brought that up, because what how do you approach that? Now I know I'm not, please forgive me, I'm not trying to ask you as if you have all the answers, right? But just in your space, when you're introducing or reintroducing these cultures and expressions to Black folk, what are some strategies that you try to implement in kind of trying to give it context and awareness?
Well, I haven't really played for Black audiences, so I don't know what would be the best way to communicate this to them. But certainly in my writing over the time when I was still really focused on it, I was always talking about the linkages between people up south and in the southeast, and things like about, Charlie Patton, all of the blues was Afro Indigenous, and how the rhythms from the stomp dance and all these sort of things informed the blues, and tried to make plain my own history with the South, and showed that you can embrace the culture and still do relevant things to this moment.
Mm-hmm. I dig that. I need to ask what the term black, the term Afro Indigenous, the term Black Indian. What do those terms, I guess, mean to you? How would you define it? Uh, yeah. What do you think?
Well, the terms that are used by default, to my mind, I don't think there should be the term Afro Indigenous. There should just be Indigenous. The white passing Indigenous people don't call themselves Euro Indigenous. They're not expected to. It's only because we are questioned in our lineage that we have these titles appended to us. So I understand why people use it, and they want to honor both sides, and that's great, and that's what should be done. But I just have issue with those terms.
So it should just be indigenous, right?
Yes.
I dig it. I dig it. Now I have to ask you. Listening to your music, I heard what I believe to be country blues, but I'm wondering, have you ever, or are you thinking about doing what people consider straight blues?
No, I'm not a blues singer, and I'm not really influenced by any blues artists. My music, I call it Native Americana. There is the Americana genre, which blends folk, country, rock,
Right.
soul, and other roots forms. And the majority of my subjects are indigenous. So that's really what my identification is with. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the Californian coastal um, country rock that emerged in the 60s. There was, with basically the artist Gene Clark, who was in the Byrds and is of indigenous descent. He could pretty much be considered the father of country rock, and blending both of those sides together. The person who's more famous for doing it is Graham Parsons, who was from Waycross, Georgia. And there's also a band I mentioned earlier, Buffalo Springfield, were from the South and also Canadian. They blended that twang into rock and into folk all at the same time. But Gene Clark is a very important indigenous artist that's overlooked and ought to be more recognized and connected to the culture by more people. He really has had a profound influence on me. I wish I could write songs as complex as his, and he had this beautiful tenor voice. Um, but
I'll throw Scrapper Blackwell into that mix. So if you're not
Otis Blackwell?
Scrapper,
Oh, I don't know Scrapper Blackwell.
I'll send you information on him. He's an indigenous blues cat.
Okay.
He ran around with Leroy Carr between uh, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky was kind of where. But I'll send you information on him.
Okay, well, my primary influences, besides the Springfield, are indigenous. It's Gene, Richie Havens, Pure Fay, and the Cherokee folk singer Karen Dalton. So
Richie Havens is one of my favorites.
yeah, he was a major influence on me. Where I discovered him when I was around 13, 14 years old, and made me want to take guitar, which I did for very, very briefly. And I got to know him a little bit after I moved to the city. I would see him live every year, and it got to the point where he would recognize me and always come and greet me before he started his show. And I think he appreciated that there were some younger Afro Indigenous people coming out who recognized him and his place in history.
Yeah.
And
Can I ask you a question? What did he consider him? What did he consider himself? If you know.
he considered himself indigenous and black. He was Blackfeet.
Okay.
He got recognized by the NAMMYs, the Native American Music Awards. So he was always aware, I think, of that part. He recorded songs like the Indian Prayer. So
Wow.
I think he was pretty self-aware.
I believe so too. But you again, being one of the first to mention that on my platform, I had to get a little bit more of that context for the audience. I appreciate that.
Well, the other main artist that I'm influenced by is Purify. She's Tuscarora, Taino, Black, and Scottish descent. And she's done a lot of work that interests you about the indigenous roots of the blues. You can see it in that film Rumble, The Indians Who Rock the World. They have a segment on that. But her work in general, you can hear it in songs like Sacred Seed, that she's really fusing these elements together. Her group Eulalie had a revolutionary effect on me, and when I decided to first start making music, it was because of her and what they did.
Well, wow. So your intentions of connecting with your indigenous side starts at 19. So a lot of this, correct me if I'm wrong, that's what I believe I remember you said. And the reason I'm asking you, because there's so much richness in different things that you were able to identify. It sounds like early on, or is this part of the entire journey?
Is what part of the entire journey?
Because it sounds like a lot of these things were early on experiences that you had that connected you to your indigenous roots. So I guess I'm a little amazed that at such a young age you were able to identify so many of these things, or am I misreading that?
No, I did. I don't know why I did. I just did. I don't know any different.
Well, I mean that's actually amazing. I guess one of the things that I'm curious about, I've heard a lot of, even in my family, it was a lot of hush hush when it came to discussing different indigenous things, and I've come to find out, because in some spaces, in the South particularly, you can get harmed for not reclassifying or different things of that nature. Now, this is more, I guess, in the southern region. Have you heard about those experiences? Were they in your family, or was your family mostly northeastern, and it was a different, I guess, atmosphere?
Well, my indigenous family is from Virginia, Ton Akamic, and um, Virginia has a very particular dark history with racial reclassification that you can read books about it. There are books specifically about Virginia's role in this. And my mother, who mostly spent time living in Africa or elsewhere abroad, had a very narrow view of the South from experiences she had there as a child. And when she came to visit me when I was living in Charlotte, where I was the music editor for Creative Loafing, she was amazed to see um, Latinos living in North Carolina. She was amazed to see multicultural groups getting together in social settings. It was very much like a shock to her after so many years being abroad. Um, so I don't have any particular stories of racial harm to impart, but um, I
So,
I had mostly positive experiences in the South during my travels when I was covering bands. I would be in Macon, Georgia, and in Nashville, and in Alabama at the Quad Cities, Muscle Shoals. And I always found welcome and fellowship there.
I know you answered this. I want to ask one more time. Which is it? Both sides of your parents, or one of your parents that has indigenous and African?
It's one side,
Okay, and is your mother or your dad?
my mother.
Okay, the reason why I'm asking is because I've heard um uh people I've heard I was told by someone rather close that w- does have an indigenous bloodline. Um, her exact words was people who wanted to be Indian didn't want to be African. And she never identified of being indigenous. Older lady, she's passed. So I was just wondering, like you took to the indigenous side, did your mother take to the African side, or was it based on?
She took to the African side because it was the times when she was in her 20s, was in the 60s, and she was very much involved in the civil rights movement
Right.
and the Black Power movement. And she had a lifelong interest in Africa that she was able to manifest as a young woman going to live there.
Wow.
And she traveled to most of the countries in Africa before she walked on. So that was her primary center. But in the years right before she walked on, she started to get interested in her indigenous heritage. And she worked on in Congress and at the State Department. So while she was back working on the Hill, she was researching about our nation through the channels of the federal government. And the last film I took her to see was The New World by Terrence Malick, which was about our nation, about Matoka and her story.
Wow. Well, I mean, I have to say, it's great to speak with a artist performer that is intentional with um, cultural and tribal information as well as familial, right? Because all of these things are not just they're genealogical, if that makes any sense. Speak which I would like to ask you in your research and in your where did your research start? Where did your research lead you? Meaning, were you doing DNA tests? Were you looking up records? Is this firsthand information coming from family members?
I haven't done any research, and I don't believe in those DNA tests. I think that the issues, the policy of blood quantum is a very negative effect on indigenous communities. And it shouldn't be pursued as a marker of people's indigeneity. Um, Most of what I know came from familial sources.
Um, that's what I thought, and that's what it sounds like, and I am happy that you made that distinction. I do my best not to try to come from a less biased place, but as a folklorist and an ethnomusicologist, familial sources, first person sources are really primary sources. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I know Skip Gates doesn't believe Black Indians exist. That's his problem.
I didn't. Well, I guess it is because they do. Now, I would like to ask the question before we start to wrap up, because a good large portion of people, when the term Black Indian is used, they're thinking of Mardi Gras Indians.
Yes, those who mask at Mardi Gras.
Right, which there is a difference between the actual Black indigenous and Mardi Gras Indians.
Yes.
Would you could you share what you know to be the difference, please?
Well, the main difference is that the people who masked Indian, as they call it, in New Orleans were of somewhat creolized descent, but are mostly from an African source. And they developed this tradition to honor the bravery of indigenous peoples that they saw and had fellowship with, or escaped to live with, or were somehow gathered to. And they do it to honor them and their memory of the indigenous peoples around in Louisiana and further across Turtle Island. But they are mostly not themselves of indigenous descent, as far as I know.
Interesting. Okay, I dig it. I dig it. Um, what would you like to leave us with? What is the at least right this second what you feel is the most pressing thing that you want to get out to the people?
Well, mainly that if you care about this issue of Afro Indigeneity, it would be really great if you could support our band, Cactus Rose NYC. We are trying to make a space for such people and forge community beyond just Lenape Hoking. And we have shows coming up. We're playing Saturday night in the East Village. We are playing two festivals next month, the New York Multicultural Festival and the Porch Stomp Festival, and which is on the solstice at Pagank. That's the native name for Governor's Island. And follow us on Instagram at Cactus Rose Loves You, and help us to get the word out. Get our EP Live from Lenape Hoking field recordings. It's available on Bandcamp. If you don't do Apple Music or iTunes or the rest, you can also listen to it on Spotify. And invite us to your communities, invite us to play your festivals. We want to get out and meet and have community with as many other Afro-Indigenous people as we can, because it's very important. It's our very survival. It's something to do to fight against the erasure of our peoples. We're pretty much invisible at this point, even though there's people like Kane Brown, who's maybe the most famous Afro-Indigenous artist in the world. Um, we need to have more of us come to prominence.
I dig it. I dig it, and I'm happy you made that call here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Vasconi.